Today, I'd like to talk about the imagination more generally, but the interest that I have recently is in images. And so there's going to be some interesting overlap with some of my colleagues, particularly with regard to drawing. And so the first half of this talk is the stuff I'm actually interested in. So I may really milk it. And then the second half is sort of what I mean by embodied cognition, since there are so many different meanings of embodied cognition. And if I have to pack it in, why not there? I'm already wasting time. All right, this is a set of images from a book that I've become obsessed with, and it is by the Czech philosopher John Amos Comenius. And years and years of studying the history of philosophy, nobody ever said Comenius' name to me. I had never heard of him before. Maybe he's better known here on the continent. Is he? I don't think so. Okay, some people. Total genius in my mind. And instead of him, we get on and on and on about Descartes. And Comenius is extremely important to me, and he was hugely important in the development of European thought because he not only did he create sort of the first illustrated children's book, which is the world in pictures, or a picture of the world, but this had a huge influence on adult education too. And for 200 years, this book was translated and published in Europe. He was invited to be the president of Harvard, which he declined so that he could go and help the education system in Sweden. And what I love about it is that he believed that images were absolutely vital for learning and for knowledge. And I'm very interested in the idea of images as epistemology. What are the ways in which images contain knowledge, and how is image making a kind of knowledge and a way of moving in the world? And here you see on the left-hand side, I regret that the resolution is kind of bad, but this is God on the left, and all I can make out is the Latin for Father and Son and Holy Spirit. I can't make out the rest of it. Also God here on the right. This is just infinitely charming to me. This is you, number 5, and you have your better angels on one side and the devil on the other, God and his justice meeting sword. And then this hapless character on the left is some practitioner of Hermetic wisdom, drawing in the sand to call out natural magic and so forth. So what Comenius would do is the book was filled with these kinds of etchings, and then the numbers would be coded to some kind of name. And the name was fun because it wasn't just a Linnaean, binomial nomenclature that was still to come in the following century. It was sort of like a noun and then a verb. What does the animal do? Like, so oxen, mooing or something. And Comenius thought that the images were absolutely crucial and more important in a way than the words. Here's some more of the text. And what he thought was that kids, it would be best if they could have a direct perception of nature, so go out and study insects, but if you can't do that, then at the very least, memorize these images in the book. And he said it would be crucially important to make the children draw these images, so to copy them. And he thought that the making of the image was itself a kind of knowledge. He thought that it actually allowed the practitioner to notice forms within forms, and it would attune their perception and also train a kind of sensory motor. He's not going to use this language, but it would train a kind of hand-eye coordination that would be of value in all kinds of crafting, craft making, and knowledge in the future. This image might be known to you from Robert Hooke's Micrographia. And so this is right around the same time, a little bit after Comenius. And Hooke famously used a microscope to analyze these creatures. These are astounding drawings. I don't know if you're fans of drawing per se, but these are just dynamite. And you'd think that this would have set philosophy down the path of imagery, and yet Hooke was already corrupted, in my mind, by Descartes, because Hooke thought Descartes had already established that the body could not be trusted, the senses are liars, and that the way to truth was going to be clear and distinct ideas. And so when Hooke publishes Micrographia, he says, I know these images are great, but beware of imagery because images are highly manipulative and they tend to affect the emotions readily and easily. So try not to use them in cases of knowledge. This is right in the Micrographia. And sure enough, people followed this. And if you look at, you could sort of tell the story of the era of the so-called scientific revolution as of an age where images became less and less valuable or prized. My own interest in this stuff is that I think images are a way of understanding embodied cognition that I don't think has gotten quite enough attention. Part of my mission is to sort of see, like, how far can I push this? It's certainly not the only way. You could easily use cooking or dance or pottery. But this is an image here of the Three Rivers petroglyphs in New Mexico. And I hiked to the top of this mountain, and these are famous in the States. Well, not famous, but they're known in this area, particularly in New Mexico. What's exciting about these images, if you look at them, they are remarkably similar in terms of their the style of rendering to something quite modern and something that you would consider to be Western. So there's this debate in the history of drawing, which is how much drawing is related to innate competencies versus just building incrementally on a conventional system that people are trained to. What's exciting about these drawings is nobody who made these drawings knew anything about the European pictorial tradition at all, because they were done hundreds of years before Columbus ever arrived in the New World. So they are way before Westerners ever got to the New World. That indicates to me, or that just a question, which is, why are they so easy for us to read? Not only are they easy to read, they're actually aesthetically charming, like a Picasso or something. So this one on the right-hand side is a bighorn sheep with arrows stuck in it. And there's some kind of like interesting design work going on. This one on the left, it's sort of internal, has a sort of boxy internal structure, and there's design elements. And so it raises this question for me about, what is innate versus what's learned. Are artists, are they sort of enacting a deep grammar of imagery in the same way that people have argued for a deep grammar in terms of language? Or are they just sort of better phenomenologists than non-artists? So then I started looking at all the literature on developmental drawing. And it turns out that this is quite universal, that on the left-hand side is what's called shape making. Have you seen your kids do this stuff? I'm sure you have some of this on your refrigerator. And so kids will do this shape making quite spontaneously if you just introduce the implements to them. And what's interesting about this is that most apes will do this too. If you give them the implements, they'll actually engage in this kind of repeated motor activity. I don't know that you want to call that art. It could be that there's something about the motion that's actually just effectively satisfying for them. There's a famous case of a chimp, I'm blanking on the name, but he would do this every day. And if he didn't get to do it, he was quite wrecked. And you'd have to drag him away even to eat. And that's actually an interesting point about precocious artists. They engage in what's called a rage for mastery, otherwise called excellence. They can't stop doing it, and so they have to be dragged away. This is fairly common in the kids that we're going to see next, who are really devoted to drawing. On the right-hand side, you see the next step, which is first it's shape making, and then come the tadpole humans. And this cracks me up because it's sort of surprising. Why would kids draw this? And yet it's very common across cultures. They find the same thing. Why would you draw? This is sort of the standard. Oops, sorry. this is sort of the standard person. You'd think, how could you get more schematic than that, right? But kids do this kind of stuff. They do the head and then this kind of weird, appendage. And I don't think anyone knows what it means. Like, why this? Is it that the head is the focal point for the kind of mirroring that the child is doing with caregivers, and the rest of it is just beside the point? Another question is this an attempt at realism, or is this an early form of iconography, which would be really weird? But why the sort of continuity? So I'm interested. So what you get after this level, of course, is remarkably just huge leaps and bounds. What's fascinating is everybody does this, but very few people do that. And the question is why? Why is drawing so different from speech and even reading? And one hypothesis is that what happens when you get just past tadpole humans, language comes online, and then it's like, well, this is a hell of a lot easier than this language, that is to say. So the argument is, it just becomes simpler and easier to move about in the world using language than the kind of training you need in order to do this stuff. And so what are some of the unique features of image making? And this is the kind of thing that you need to accomplish if you're going to be a competent artist. Occlusion, these are really surprisingly difficult. Foreshortening, linear perspective that is the most difficult hurdle to overcome. And as I'm sure many of you have tried it or done it, it's extremely difficult to do and master. But diminution, sfumato, which is basically the sort of shading out or basic graying out of the background so that it looks quite in the distance. You could argue, well, these are conventions, but then the question is like, what's the relationship between that and actual perception? Getting the shadowing right is like way more complicated than you might think it is. And so this kind of stuff, I wonder, what are the parallels with speech and reading? I don't think there's been a lot of work on this, but so then it raises questions about perceptual or attentional advantages. Drawing is a near ubiquitous activity in childhood, yet few individuals master the ability to create sophisticated, accurate representations in adulthood. Yet there's also evidence of children showing adult-like depictive skills prior to any formal training. Suggestions drawing may have an innate component. I'm leaning in this direction. I suspect not very many people in the room are leaning in this direction, but that's all right. I know you guys are sort of affordances all the way up, and that's fine. But there is this interesting question, which is, what's the relationship between a kid that can draw like this on the right, which is Nadia Chomin? Some of you may have heard of her because I think it was it Humphreys that said, compared her work to the cave paintings. I think it was Paul Humphreys. Many people noticed that she was autistic, but had an insanely good ability to draw. So at a very early age, she was drawing animals that looked like they could have come from Lascaux or Chauvet or something. And then she quickly moved to this kind of, this is like a 3/4 foreshortening image, very difficult for a kid to achieve. And so originally what they thought was that there was an IQ test called Draw a Man. And for obvious reasons, they changed it to Draw a Person more recently, but it started in the 1920s, and it was with us until the 1960s when it was thrown out. But the idea was have a kid draw a person, and the level of detail that they're able to achieve, it will be an indication of their IQ. The work that these folks, Chamberlain, Drake, Cosbelt, Wagemans, are doing now their findings suggest just the opposite, that there is no correlation between precocious drawing and IQ. In fact, there seems to be, in some cases, a reverse correlation. The artist on our right was diagnosed with autism, and the artist on our left is Stephen Wiltshire. Has anybody seen Wiltshire's drawings? Because there's YouTube clips and everything. He's contemporary, he's drawing now. This guy looks at the New York skyline once and then draws it accurately from memory, like weeks later. And it's staggering and incredibly weird. He also has been diagnosed with autism. There's two kinds of, the suggestion is that there's a kind of local processing bias that both groups have, where some people who have this precocious drawing ability can really focus on some very small details. There's two ways to draw things. One is like, if you're drawing a face, here's one way to do it. You start with the oval, and then you sort of create these landmarks. And you're kind of taught to do it this way. And then what you do is you start just slowly kind of bringing in detail, and you're kind of massaging it from, from looking at it and then making adjustments and then coming back, and then you start adding little features like this. So it's a very piecemeal process, and you are working from the holistic view to the details, always checking and getting accuracy. That's the way most people draw. These folks draw like this. They draw one detail, they move, they draw the other detail. They never like check, they never do like an outline, they never look at the holistic picture. They don't move from one part until they're done with it, then they move to the next part. That's very rare. And if you've seen it, it looks kind of miraculous. It's kind of shocking. And there's lots of, I follow a few of these folks on Instagram. It's astounding to watch their drawing skills. I think there's two radically different kinds of processing going on here, or maybe there's just two different kinds of embodied cognition happening. There's also some interesting questions about maybe what they're doing is not intellectual per se, but they're just perceiving differently, or they're better at perceiving in some ways. So here are this is completely new speculation. This has just come out in the last couple of years. And so there's been empirical work on a couple of these, which I'll mention, but for the most part, a lot of these are untested hypotheses on the right-hand side. One suggestion is they have kids who can draw really well have the ability to overcome shape constancy. So if I show you a plate and I turn the plate, what happens for most kids is they see the plate as a disc, and then ever after they keep drawing it as a disc, like no matter where it is, like if it's on the table, if it's over here. Whereas a certain kid can actually overcome their theoretical commitment to the disc, and if you turn the object, they can see it's an oval, and or it's flat. And this is just something that most kids don't do. They right away corrupt their perception with their theory. And so if you ask it, if you show most kids, here you show a kid a coffee cup like this with a handle, they'll draw it like that. Then you turn the coffee cup so that the handle is facing away from you. And and an artistic kid will look at the thing and draw this. But the vast majority of kids cannot help but put the handle back on the cup, like they just cannot resist. And so there's this sort of battle happening between their perception and their conception. Enhanced local processing of visual details, reduction in holistic processing, better visual memory, enhanced ability to recognize degraded images or to pick out embedded visual patterns. There is some interesting empirical work on this. It turns out that artistic kids are better able to pick out embedded visual patterns. Lower susceptibility to visual illusions. Enhanced mental rotation is interesting. I think probably a lot of you guys know the mental rotation literature by Koslin and Eilish and stuff. If you look at this test, you'll show someone those pairs and you'll ask them, let's say the A pair, is that first set of blocks the same as the second, just in a rotated position? Or are they two different structures? And it turns out that artistic people are better at this kind of identification. Like I'm not sure, but I think A is the same object rotated, and I think C is not. Anybody want to corroborate my intuitions on this? All right. You're not sure either. Okay, so now why am I interested in this? I think that there's a kind of way to use this material to get at the mind. This is certainly by no means, maybe this is not the best way to do it, but it's one that I'm pretty devoted to. What are the dominant assumptions about mind versus the sort of embodied cognition view that a lot of us in here are fans of? The dominant assumptions in philosophy are that the mind is a collection of preset modules. These are not all, these are just different traditions which have been ruling the day for a while now. That top one is very common in evolutionary psychology. That's the Tooby and Cosmides and Pinker view. Or the mind is a prediction calculator based on Bayesian probability inferences. That's still has considerable ascendancy. The mind is a digital computer. The mind is produced by language, either natural language or lingua mentis. My understanding is that the lingua mentis hypothesis is making a comeback. I'm not happy about this, but there's like a new paper in BBS coming out. We have to return to the Jerry Fodor days of some kind of internal language. And then the imagination, one of the results of all of this is that there's a tendency to see the imagination as simply a folk psychology reducible to other cognitive systems. I know this group is not probably of that mind, but it's still part of the dominant view. To contrast that, we have the embodied cognition tradition that we're all sort of exploring. And I'm influenced by the Merleau-Ponty idea, that the mind is really not about representing the world per se or even describing it, but trying to get maximum grip on one's environment. And to that end, I think drawing is an attempt to get maximum grip, and I think the imagination really fits in here. Very quick sketch in the history of philosophy for those who aren't following this. Aristotle is different from Plato in a sense. Plato's rather more dismissive of the imagination. Aristotle thinks it's absolutely vital as a kind of distinct capacity or faculty between perception and mind. In De Anima, it plays a huge mediating role between percepts and concepts. He says that in virtue of which an image occurs in us. Voltaire actually has a very interesting passage in his encyclopedia on imagination, and he makes this great distinction between passive and active imagination. I read it recently just to get ready for this. I was going to quote it, but I'm short on time. But he says, the passive imagination is a lot like Kant's notion of the imagination, where the dreaming brain can take memories and then sort of they'll dance around he says in the head of both the dog and the hunter in similar ways, it's involuntary. But then the active imagination is when you bring it sort of under greater voluntary control and you engage in these combinatorial activities where you take part of one image and another image and you fuse them together. This is something I'm really interested in because if you look at the history of cultural memes, you'll find that frequently they are, if you're looking at Gilgamesh or you're looking at the Egyptian cultures, you'll find this very common hybridization of two zoological categories. You find a creature, the Greeks and the Romans love this stuff, hybrids, chimera. It seems like some of the earliest, even in Gilgamesh, there's a monster like this. And so I'm fascinated by, is there a kind of early image grammar where you can take parts of one animal and graft it with another? And Dan Sperber has argued that something like this gives gives your meme, legs, because something weird like that will be transmitted very rapidly, horizontally and vertically across, your peer group and also down to other generations. Thus, we get religion. Kant's imagination also takes a stab at it, but then it goes sort of dark for imagination for a long time, and then it starts to reemerge in the, I don't know where to put this exactly. We could argue about it. My own teacher was Mark Johnson, and Mark Johnson and George Lakoff, you'll recall, created the metaphor theory of language. And they were drawing on this idea of prototype concepts, which I also like because it lends itself so well to imagery. So if I say to you, think of a bird, what do you get in your mind's eye? In my case, it's sort of like a robin or starling or something, because I'm from the Midwest, from Chicago. It's kind of this rather humble looking bird. And that the argument of prototype concepts is that here would be the robin, and then out like radial categories come the other kinds of birds where I wouldn't be putting, here I might put a seagull. If this is a robin, I might put a seagull here. But way out here, I might put like an ostrich or a penguin. And so one way to think about concepts is not that they're the traditional linguistic classifying criteria like bird equals oviparous, biped, having beak, feathers, and wings. That dominated from Aristotle on down. But rather, you just get a kind of prototypical image in your mind's eye, and then you use that to categorize and understand your experience better. So it is thinking with images, not metaphorically, but literally. And there is this literature that some of you guys must be tracking now on aphantasia versus phantasics. And we were talking about this yesterday in the group, and some of us think more with images, and some of us think more with language. And this turns out to be pretty interesting, because an extreme form of thinking only with language is that you can't form mental images. And what we're finding is that those folks are sort of overrepresented statistically in fields like engineering, and folks that have very active image-based kind of cognition are heavily represented in the arts. That's no mystery. So I'm interested in thinking of the imagination adaptively in terms of its evolution, why it works the way it does, and what are its sort of functions. How does it attempt to achieve maximum grip? And so there's three ways, and I'll just briefly go through some of these. One is, I think, knowledge investigation. And here, and then secondly is social cognition, and then therapeutic processing. Spend a little more time on knowledge investigation. Image making boosts morphological insight, understanding of form and formative process. It's interesting that the great German poet Goethe, known more for his literature than his science, was a really great scientist. And he thought that there was a kind of archetypical plant, the Urpflanze, and he thought he was going to find it in Italy, and then he gave up on that and said, nah, it's more like a Platonic archetype. And this had a big influence on biology that followed him. People like Richard Owen created a vertebrate archetype, and there was this huge debate in evolution, where are the archetypes? But he made a more general point, which I think still is informative, which is, he said, if you look at art and you study line making and morphological drawing, it will help you understand nature. And he thought that morphology was first the study of the final completed form, the Gestalt, and then the formative Bildung, the formative processes that create the Gestalt. And he thought that that was the route to go, and that was the master science. And to my mind, and to a lot of other people, this is a highly image-oriented way of thinking. Images act as Gestalt-like networks of affordances or use scaffolds. This is something that hopefully we'll be able to, we'll be able to discuss later. And then images act as inferential prediction structures for analogical reasoning and prototype classification. We were just talking about that. Images capture and retain somatic evaluative content. I'm sort of calling this affective chunking. There's a way in which the image is a lot more analog than, to my mind, than say language. Or maybe the way to say it is that the image is closer to its experiential origin than language is. And as a result of that, my view is that they are able to contain affective content in a very, with a high fidelity, and something that then triggers the affective content in the viewer pretty readily, somatic markers and such. Understanding via the kinetic drawing process is a form of sense making that capitalizes on the embodied simulation system that we share with other mammals. A lot to unpack there, but I think a lot of you guys already know this kind of argument. And then this is weirder, and I'm not sure I understand this entirely, but that lastly, I'm thinking that creating or making images takes you through, via mimicry, some aspect of the entity's causal history, that you are tracing the efficient causation of the thing, either as it was built, if you can do a cutaway, or you can work with the object, or in nature, you anatomize nature. And drawing it, in a sense, is taking you through some of the causal history of the thing that might not be able to be achieved otherwise. In terms of social cognition, mental imagery and self-perception are essential to introspective, retrospective, and prospective behaviors. I'll just say this and move on for the sake of time. In addition to direct perception, humans explore and fit themselves into their social niche through imaginative virtual scenario construction. Such social cognition is mythopoetic, not logical. It's not explicitly inductive or hypothetical deductive. It's not that images themselves are automatically mythopoetic. I think some images are, but they're oftentimes pretty clearly implicated in the narrative virtual reality that we're running in our heads. And that's very much tied to things like ritual and early story. And it helps us sort of understand ourselves and others to engage in this kind of virtual reality. Like there's sort of a lot of attention now being given to literature as a kind of, I think this is a little reductionistic, but a kind of threat management. You're getting ready for when you have to face the zombie apocalypse. So that's why you're engaging in all these sort of virtual reality movies and films and so on. All right, and then the therapeutic processing. I think creative visualization, of course, very popular as a kind of psychological or psychoanalytic technique. There is it's kind of an interesting form of it that goes back to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And I don't know if I have time for this, but maybe a little hover here. If you think about the meditation techniques in Theravada Buddhism, like Vipassana, and some of those early forms of meditation, you'll see that the goal is to try to clear the mind or purify the mind of its image contents, and of course desire and everything else. And so you're trying to arrive at some kind of bare field consciousness, some unconditioned. And that's one of the key sort of trance states of sati or mindfulness. But in the Tibetan tradition, more is more. And so what you want to do is not clear the mind, but actually engage in a kind of very elaborate visual imagining of the gods and their helpers. And so you do this kind of training where there's a very famous meditation that comes out of the Diamond Sutra teachings, where you envision a tree and then you populate that tree with your own spiritual helpers or your own heroes. And then in meditation, when you're having a bad day or you're troubled, you can, through creative visualization, you meditate and you go to the tree and you start getting advice from this virtual guru. And it's baked into Tibetan Buddhism and Bhutan Buddhism. And so the imagination there actually is revelatory of insights that you may not have been able to encounter on your own. I know it's your mind, but you know what I mean? Like you would not have been able to just think about it and get this information, supposedly. So there is a sense in which there's some new interesting work, Hamilton 2020, on monster therapy, because apparently there are a lot of soldiers, for example, who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and when they have an episode, many of them will claim that an actual monster appears in their peripheral vision and then comes close by as a kind of I guess it's a kind of phenomenological presence and also a symbol of what happened to them. And it's very intrusive. And so the therapist will then use monster images and stories to try to recalibrate. You set that monster into a narrative where the monster is repudiated, or you learn to live with the monster. In any case, this kind of imagery and imagination is having some therapeutic successes. Okay, so now how does all this work? I want to very quickly go through how I see a sort of biosemantic view, embodied cognition view that's probably different from this, the affordance view that's kind of hot now. But I've been heavily influenced by affective neuroscience, Jaak Panksepp's work. I was lucky enough to work with him a little bit before he died. And here, let me just quickly sketch a view that really descends from Ruth Millikan's idea of push me, pull you representations. Millikan pointed out that representations are, in a sense, Janus-faced. They're both indicative and imperative. At one moment, it's picking out, if I say dog, I'm picking out a kind of creature that is different from other entities in the room, but also there's an imperative meaning, maybe in the tone of my voice and in all the associations that you're carrying around with you, which is maybe, run away, or at least you have the frisson of negative affect or something. In other words, everything has this dual capacity. And the argument, this biosemantic argument, is that basically animals are living in a purely imperative world of representations, where every sign is a nudge to do something. And it's only humans then that have evolved a way to decouple the indicative function away from the imperative function of the sound. And so the signs and the symbols then become much more useful because you can decouple them from the stimulus that you're surrounded by and use them in the imagination. Obviously, people have suggested that's what happened with language. I'm suggesting that that happened to images way before language. I don't know how old language is, but I believe images are contending for earlier. Certainly written language is like 30,000 years younger than the archaeological record on imagery. So, all right, that leads me to a speculative history of, sorry, what a ridiculous title for this slide, a speculative history of stimulus-independent signals. You can put your own dates on this. I'll try to suggest a few as we go through this from left to right. Conceding that it's highly speculative, although not completely arbitrary. First, you have automatic animal vocalizations. I'm interested in how you end up with usable, manipulable signs or signals that you can craft inside your head in a virtual way. So first, you have animal vocalizations. I think this simulation system thesis is compelling. And you can see in the great apes that they're able to sort of have a task grammar. You'll see, like the gorillas, for example, in Rwanda, they eat these, they eat nettles. And if you've ever had a nettle scraped against you, you know that you don't want that in your mouth. So they take the nettle and then they have this fairly elaborate way of folding it so that all the pins or spines of the nettle are folded inside. And then they put this packet in their mouth and chew it down. That's pretty sophisticated task grammar, where you have a kind of routine that keeps getting added onto, and you get subroutines, and you get a complexity of action that's highly adaptive. Great apes use hand gestures. It's kind of interesting that if you, one theory of language, of course, is that it started with gestures, and great apes will do this thing where if insects are itching you, you'll scratch your body like this for obvious reasons. But then it turns out that if I do this now to my conspecific, my friend, if I'm a chimp, my friend reads that as groom me please. So it's interesting to see how does an automatic sort of sound or gesture get turned into something that then can be exapted for other functions. Craft making, mental templates. If you look at the development in Acheulean industry, so we're looking now at sort of the upper Paleolithic, all of a sudden the technology gets way more sophisticated. You can make an Oldowan hammer really easy by just looking at one. But as soon as you get to the Acheulean industry, it gets way more interesting and complex. And now you need teaching. And the argument is that this might be when you actually start to get mental templating of these craft processes, because that's the only way that you can teach it. That's one theory. Dance and music, I think, is probably earlier than this. Craft making, iconicity, push me, pull you language, indicative language, last. Reading is the cheesecake. Reading is sort of the last in this sort of trajectory of abstraction. But my own view is that all along the bottom, you see that what's holding it all together is the affective systems. That homeostatic emotional systems are there at the beginning, and they're all the way through the end. And what that means is language, my view of language is that it is largely kind of indicative signaling system, but the seeds of its imperative roots are contained within it. So when you hear a word, for example, apple, that is a fairly abstract term that is triggering the cascading set of sensory impressions that originated. The taste, the smell, the look of it. And so every time you're using language, even if it's fairly abstract, you are engaging this embodied affective system. There are these sort of somatic markers. How does this get made? It's not a miracle. I think Cecilia Hayes has been working on this idea of matching vertical associations in a very impressive way, where we are all wired, our sensory and our motor systems are all wired together by a Hebbian principle of what fires together wires together. So babies will spend a lot of time looking at their hands. In fact, 2/3 of their waking life, they're laying on their back and they look at their hands. And the argument is that by looking at your hand, closing and opening it, you are feeling it and in the motor system, and you are seeing it as a visual perception. This wires together, and you end up, this arguably creates a kind of shared manifold, where when I see you undergoing a certain kind of pain or even a motor activity, my brain actually mirrors that to some degree. So all of this is perhaps too much at the end, and they're getting the hook out to pull me off. But I'll nod towards the other influences, and then maybe in the question and discussion part, you might want to dig in on certain things. In the same way that you have to pair together the visual perception, let's say, and the motor ability just to draw anything, I believe it's a triangle. And the third thing you're always pairing, or rather adding to this Hebbian correlation is affect, whether it's a really basic approach and avoid, or some of these more active affective systems like fear, lust, and so forth. So Panksepp's work has been influential to me. That's quickly a guide of it. And then I think that this actually is related to reading in all the ways that you were talking about in your talk, because even in the pacing of the poetry, you get the sort of embodied feel as the reader of how your body wants to move in this kind of waltz or whatever. So maybe that's a good place to wrap up the formal comments and then see if you guys have questions. Thank you. Was I on time?
Now it is on, yes. Thank you very much, Stephen, for a fascinating and rich talk. I know we are well into the lunch break, but one question, and it's better be a very good one. Who's first?
No pressure.
Wow. Got in? Yes.
So I was thinking a lot of things as I was listening to you. Thank you very much for that. My question is actually to do with the way in which you're trying to pull apart image and language. And I'm kind of wondering, I mean, I see why you do it, but I'm kind of wondering if that is necessary. To give you an example, I've been looking into authors' manuscripts to work with the question of creativity and how they arrive at writing something. And quite often there are doodles and drawings or mapping out the city where something is set. So it seems to me very much that, at least as far as the creative process is concerned, it's always multimodal.
Yeah, and I agree, there is no really good reason why I should be teasing these apart, but I will say it betrays some of my interests in the evolution of these systems. So part of me always wants to know, what was it like before language? And it's very common in philosophical circles to say, you don't have meaning of any kind until you have language. If the 20th century in particular thought that all meaning is propositional. And so what all animals are doing, according to this tradition, is just stimulus response. And the reason why I want to tease these apart is because I want to make the case for a kind of image manipulation, task grammar before language ever evolved. But you're right, with regard to humans, it's completely mixed together. Yeah.